Okay, happy Monday, everyone. Ah, okay, let's get situated and get ready to go. So, yeah, I thought I'll let a couple of people filter in, hopefully. But if you are just joining me from having viewed on Destiny's stream on Friday, welcome. I hope this will be of some interest to you. Right. So, yeah, basically, what I figured I would do today is both take questions from anyone who wants to ask any about existential risk or related topics, but I also thought I'd respond to, well, kind of give a bit of a post-mortem on the discussion I had with Destiny on Friday, and maybe respond to one or two of the pieces of criticism that came up. Um, Much of which I think was very reasonable, some of which was a little bit mean perhaps, but by and large, I think there's some pretty reasonable and important points in there that I'd like to kind of respond to and delve into a little bit. Um, so, so I suppose that takes me to the first one. Let me find. There was someone who wrote this in a reasonably amusing and uh, here we go. Okay, the bro who doesn't lift. Um, so to post normal, timey advice from the audience. Don't repeat yourself unless it's necessary. Don't go in circles. Get to the point. Don't use the same argument with a slight variation or added info. Just add the info without repeating yourself. Try to use yeah, less, and don't repeat yourself unless it's necessary. So I think this kind of summed up a fair bit of criticism that was coming in chat during the conversation, and it's so part of it, the kind of ums and ahs and so forth, and some of the other criticisms as well, things like that my voice is monotone or that I have a lot of vocal fry, are things that I do need to work on. Um, um, Particularly the and ah thing. I say that quite a lot when speaking, and it can be a bit distracting. And I just need to get a bit better at maybe taking a little pause instead of saying or ah, and just trying to use those less. So I think that's entirely reasonable. It's something I'm trying to work on, but I'm not perfect, and hopefully I will improve there. Uh, the repeating yourself point, I it's a really difficult one. So I'm aware of a few times where I think I just did repeat myself gratuitously, and I should just not do that. That is a problem with the way I delivered it, and it's something I need to avoid. But sometimes when I'm repeating myself, I'm doing it consciously because I want to emphasize a point or because I don't want to be misunderstood. And I think it's a part of it is that it's a way of communicating in academia that you tend to write out your point each time so it's completely unambiguous and then add changes to it rather than simply referring back to the previous one. So it makes for clearer communication, but it doesn't necessarily make for more compelling communication. And I think that's a balance I really need to try to learn better how to strike uh, between getting my point across and not belaboring it. So that's something that came up a fair bit, and I think that's possibly part of the medium, but yeah, just something I need to get a bit better at. And there I go, repeating myself again. So something to work on. The boring aspect. This came up a couple of times, and on the one hand, I think there are probably some people, particularly watching live, who were just expecting to see, Destiny having a high-spirited philosophical debate with someone who's going to argue a lot and get kind of into the weeds and a bit shouty, or playing video game stuff. So obviously, if you come in expecting that kind of content, and you have me, a academic who keeps on hedging his statements and keeps on trying to present things in as precise but not misleading a way as I can, then it's going to be a bit boring. But I think there's a if that was my takeaway, then I wouldn't improve, and it would be to my detriment, because I think there is a important point in there that I and other people communicating these ideas need to get better at making them engaging and at making them, I don't want to say fun, but exciting, and the sort of thing that you really want to listen to, and the sort of thing that a general audience would listen to if it didn't have Destiny on the video title. So while my initial response to some of the boring stuff, and midway through the video towards the end, there's a bit where I just completely brain farted. That was in part because I'd looked over chat and got just really quite thrown by seeing lots of people going boring, boring, which but like I say, so my initial response to it was kind of a bit, well, fuck you guys. But I think there's a really important point in there, which is that I can't just expect people to pay attention to me simply because I think my idea is interesting or is important. I've got to make it captivating. And in some ways, to make it interesting to everyone, I would need to engage in some trade-offs that I'm not willing to make. So, by to over sensationalize it, or to sort of skimp on the science. But I think there's a lot of ground in between where I can either uh, enhance the amount of interest I generate with a trivial trade-off in accuracy, or even enhance its interestingness um, without any actual loss of efficacy. I've got a comment here. I think part of the problem is making it feel relevant, which is part of the whole argument. Yeah, it is. Making it feel relevant is a big part of it, and it's something that I think I could have done a lot better in this discussion, because I had quite a few anecdotes lined up that, had I focused on those more, I think it would have not necessarily detracted much from my broader point of just listing all of the scary things that could happen, but potentially would have been a bit more engaging, given it a bit of a hook that makes it kind of more personal. And it's something that a lot of people writing on this topic, Toby Ord, the Eric Schlosser's book Command and Control, um, it's one of the reasons why I found Command and Control a little bit difficult to get through, because it had so much of a focus on these anecdotes, which I personally don't tend to find as compelling. I'm much more interested in the sort of the theory and the data on like the frequency of bad occurrences or the impact of bad occurrences. But anecdotes can be so useful for illustrating a point, and can be so useful for getting people to remember it and to pay attention, because we like stories. That's a part of human nature. So if I had been uh, functioning better, if I had been performing better, I might have told people about the case of Janet Parker's death in the, let me just check the date. This is one of the reasons I don't do anecdotes very much, because I'm terrible with dates. 1978. So Janet Parker was a medical photographer working in Birmingham in the UK, and she was working in the darkroom, which was situated above a viral studies lab. And in 1978, smallpox had been wiped out in the wild. Were no more cases of naturally occurring smallpox. But unfortunately, something bad occurred in the security of the lab, and somehow it got out. It may have leaked up through a drainage pipe, we still don't know. but Janet Parker contracted smallpox and she succumbed to it. Several members of her family also got it, and I think her mother. Just want to double check who actually died. I believe her dad survived, but her mum died. Um, but she was the very last person to die of it. So yeah, sorry, her dad died um, as a result of the infection. Um, but Janet Parker herself succumbed in. Uh, this is the other reason I can't do anecdotes. So succumbed to the smallpox, and she was the last person to die of the disease. Now, had I been had I prepared more on the anecdote side of things, on the kind of presentation side of things, I probably would have been able to deliver that a little bit better. And that kind of brings me to a criticism of how I performed that I think is kind of key to this boring thing, is that I spent too much time preparing a what I think to be at least a pretty rock solid argument, and not enough on the style of it, the presentation. And I don't mean to say that in the sense that I'm some five-head galaxy brain who spent all of his time focusing on the important things, because the style and the communication is extremely important, and it doesn't matter how right I might be about the science and the risk involved if nobody pays attention. So yeah, I think that's all stuff that I do need to work better on. And I had an interesting chat today with a specialist in global catastrophic biological risks, and we were discussing the kind of challenges of communicating this kind of information. And excuse me. And I don't have any easy answers, but I think if I can work on, now that I've got a solid handle on a lot of the evidence, the kind of meat of the argument, I think I can work on improving the presentation and hopefully, yeah. So again, going around in circles a little bit, but I think that's worth taking into account. There were also some criticisms of my scientific arguments, which I think are worth getting into. Um, so we've got Destiny got ummed in this debate. Entire video is snooze. Okay, okay. Uh, where was that comment I was looking for? Okay, yeah, it's this Polka guy. So this comment, I think that they have misunderstood what I was trying to say, which is a concern in and of itself because I should have communicated in a way that is clear. This person clearly has some understanding of biology, and if they didn't get what I was trying to say, then that's a bit of a problem. So no, we are not able to create a new disease in lab, presumably, which will certainly work in the human body. We are not able to simulate human body in any way or shape. There are simply too many things in a body that take place. We can't even simulate what happens in a cell. We usually change only a protein of a virus, and that takes already long. Further, we have no idea what the new protein will do. If we want to create a new disease, we must design the virus. We are not there yet. We do not know how protein changes affect the life cycle of the virus in the human body. Who is this guy? This is stupidly wrong. He conflates two different things. He talks about randomly engineering a new disease. This happens in nature a million times every second. Most of the viruses that are created through mutation are harmless. When we talk about designing a virus, we talk about a virus that does exactly what we want in a human body, and we are not there yet. So I would absolutely agree with this person's characterization that we don't have the ability to engineer a virus with all of the precise characteristics that we might want to implement. We don't have the ability to, say, uh, take a virus that has a let's say, has an eclipse phase of 2 weeks. That's a period between getting the virus and getting infected with the virus and symptoms showing. We don't have the ability to just switch on and off whichever genes we want and create one that goes from 2 weeks to 5 weeks, for example. We don't have that predictive ability, and if I gave the impression that we do, then that's on me because I did not mean to give that impression. What we do have the ability to do is two different things, which I, I think I did conflate a bit, partially because I was talking about genetic technology in general and talking about the general ways that we can engineer viruses or any pathogen, any sort of biological system. And I probably should have been a bit clearer about how that works. So there's two broad ways that we can do this. The first is mutations, and this guy talks about it. It talks about it happens in nature a million times every second. Most of the viruses created through mutation are harmless. That's absolutely true. Um, the vast majority of mutations in any organism either do nothing or are deleterious to the organism. Um, but let's see if I can find there's a great uh, video of this of the way that we can direct evolution. Um, so gaining resistant. There's this fantastic video which here we go. Right. So the idea here is that they have a big petri dish of agar, which is what bacteria can grow on, substrate for growing, and each of these lines is a different concentration. Each of these sections is a different concentration. Here we go of antibiotic. Excuse me. So this is no antibiotic and one dose and 10 times the concentration, 100 times concentration, 1,000. So each step is going up by a factor of 10. Now this involves no fancy genetic tweaking, no kind of transgenic techniques. All they do is put the bacteria at each end of the plate, let it grow, and then gradually these little bits here, yeah, are bacteria that have bacterial populations, portions of the population that have developed resistance to the antibiotic. So they're able to spread, and you'll notice this line where the bacteria, where the next increasing concentration is, didn't take very long at all for the bacteria to, this is time lapse of course, but didn't take very long at all for the bacteria to spread. And you can see this tree of life evolving where different populations of bacteria have got more common and outcompeted the others, and then made it to the end plate and had to mutate again in order to survive to get to the next level. And indeed, you can branch it out as a network. So you get a mutation occurring here. This is, I believe they did genomic analysis. A mutation occurring here that spreads, and then the populations split off. And some of these mutations make them better able to survive at higher levels of antibiotic. It's not that any of the ones surviving to the end here could have survived 1,000-fold dose of the antibiotic, but through successive generations, they're able to effectively engineer a bacterium that has several strains of bacteria that have vastly greater resistance to antibiotics than the base type does. So in a similar way, it's entirely possible without having any knowledge of the genetics involved to use directed evolution using artificial selection to create potentially very concerning pathogens. And this is what was done in the 2011 gain of function experiments that I discussed. If I have my link here. Um, Here we go. So there's a decent news story on it here, and I can. But this is Ron Fauci's team at the Erasmus Medical Center. They took H5N1 avian flu, which isn't very contagious in people, but is potentially very lethal. And without doing any genetic editing themselves, they managed to direct its mutation and get it functioning to transmit between mammals, between ferrets, which is extremely concerning and is an example of how you can do this kind of engineering, this kind of modification of a pathogen without touching any transgenic techniques. Transgenic techniques, by which I mean lab techniques where we are inserting genes into a organism or a virus. Whether or not a virus is an organism is arguable, but we'll kind of ignore that for the time being. Um, so randomly engineering new disease, yeah, it does happen. He's correct that I say he, they, I don't know if their gender. Most of the viruses created through mutation are harmless, but we can direct that. So while most are harmless, we can select for the ones that aren't harmless. And when it when we talk about engineering, we don't need to know exactly what it does in the human body in order to be confident that it's going to do something bad. Um, so uh, we can easily imagine a rogue state, say North Korea, who probably do have a bioweapons program, and if they do, it could well be quite bad. Um, could use human testing to simply go through generation after generation of a virus or bacterium or whatever in order to select for the traits we want. Um, the ability to tweak individual viral genes and to guarantee or to even have a high degree of confidence about the end effect that's going to have, yeah, that is, many years off, although probably not as many years as we might suspect because this technology is moving very fast. Um, though, as they point out quite correctly, we're not able to. We're currently very far away from being able to simulate all of the downstream effects of modulating one specific protein or any aspect of a specific pathway. Um, but we do have on a kind of wide an organism level scale. We can't predict what doing one thing guaranteed will do to the overall organism, but we do have a lot of ways of guessing and guessing moderately accurately, um, and ways of identifying parts of the pathway that might be effective for targeting. So this is kind of the way that the drug design is done. We don't necessarily simulate all of the biochemical interactions that occur around a specific system. We look at specific ways that you can target the drug, specific ways that the potential drugs might interact with parts of that system, and mess around with them until we find one that seems to do what we want it to. And this process is expensive, but it's also very much constrained by a whole bunch of institutional safety ethical factors that aren't as big of an issue for bad actors, whether that's rogue states or bioterrorists or something in between, because state-sponsored bioterrorism is a definite possibility. So if I gave the impression, and this is again going back to the communication point, if I gave the impression at any point that I'm saying that we can take a virus today and easily tweak a single protein and predict what exactly the effects of that are going to be, and then release it out into the populace, I don't believe that. And if that's the impression I gave, I apologise. Um, what I was trying to say was that we, first of all, we currently have the technology to do some very nasty things with pandemics, to engineer them using things like directed evolution. Second, we currently have the fundamental technology that is necessary for more targeted, more specific forms of engineering of pathogens. And third, that we will be able to, in the near future, quite plausibly, engineer pathogens in more directed, specific ways as these technologies advance and the kind of risk of this occurring increases. So it's a difficult line. I think I did all right at communicating it, but evidently not as well as I could have done. Um, there was another person. I'm just picking on YouTube comments because they're easy to see here, but I think most of these criticisms, here we go, are fairly similar to some of the ones that were being raised live by chat. Um, man-made, I presume, superviruses is not a threat because they're not something that being weaponized. If a killer virus is turned loose, it kills your people just like their people. Hard to convince someone to make it, and a chain of command that would want to turn it loose. I don't think this is a very compelling argument. It was raised a few times in chat, uh, largely because essentially what they seem to be saying is that the disincentives to using a biological weapon are so great that nobody will ever want to. Um, which it's certainly true that there are lots of negatives about biological weapons that would make a rational actor hesitate to use them, and it's probably one of the big reasons why uh, basically nobody has developed uh, very large scale weaponized bioweapons, at least that we're aware of. Russia had quite large stockpiles in the towards the end of the 20th century, but it's a major reason for why they're not more widely used, at least. The thing is, most of the actors that we're thinking about are not necessarily those who are most predisposed to hearing reason, or are those who would act out of desperation. So, for example, state actors like North Korea, if the regime were being seriously threatened, North Korea has a state-sponsored program of smallpox vaccination. It's one of the only places in the world that still fairly widely does smallpox vaccination, as by my understanding, certainly of their military. And they may well have access to smallpox in their laboratories. Officially, the only places that smallpox is stored is a lab in Novosibirsk, the vector lab in Russia, and the United States CDC in Atlanta, Centers for Disease Control. But in practice, as recently as 2014, there was certainly unidentified specimens of variola, the smallpox virus, in a biosafety level 3 lab in the United States. This was found recently. I think it was a FDA laboratory, not even a biosafety level 4 one, just in the back of a freezer. They found some smallpox. So that's reassuring. So there's almost certainly a few samples kicking around, and there's a decent chance that North Korea has saved a few. Um, Whether or not it's weaponizing it is an open question. We can hope not, but if it were, it seems pretty easy to imagine a circumstance in which North Korea would take the calculated risk that releasing smallpox into South Korea for the purposes of blunting an invasion would be worthwhile, given that the substantial portion, at least of their military, is immunized against it, and South Korea probably not. Um, Similarly, we can certainly envisage terrorists who would want to, who either would want to get rid of the world, Om Shinrikyo, the Japanese doomsday cult, comes to mind. They wanted to basically enact a massive global conflict that would destroy most of the population, and they released excuse me, sarin onto the Tokyo subway in the 90s. um, excuse me. Um, so yeah, uh, I mean, every day we see states do things which don't have their populace best interest at heart. Current pandemic response here and in the US seems case in point. Yeah, absolutely. There are lots of things that states might do that could certainly harm their populace that they don't necessarily care about that much. Um, and particularly when you get to states that are very kleptocratic and that mainly have their own self-interest at heart. Um, but yeah, doomsday cults as well. And then you've got the fact that it could just be all a big accident. So it's entirely plausible that though I don't think COVID-19 was released from the biological research lab in Wuhan, it's not impossible that it was. And though it's definitely not an engineered disease, uh, there are labs around the world that work with pathogens and do tests on them, including genetic tests, where they modulate how the pathogen works and thereby potentially make it more dangerous. There was some, uh, uh, yeah, sorry, I'm thinking of something else. So there are various studies that are done that could produce dangerous pathogens, and there's a non-zero chance of them escaping, just like there's a non-zero chance that COVID-19 got out of a lab, even though it probably didn't. That we've got the, the, the likelihood of it having been released from having spread from nature is far greater, but it's not something we can't definitively rule out. These kind of lab accidents do happen reasonably frequently. There have been hundreds in the US uh, alone every year, and most of those we only know about because the US is reasonably good at reporting them. There are lots of places that do high level biological research that aren't nearly as effective. So it's not just the probability of a rational state releasing it, it's also, a potential risk of just getting loose. Let's see if there's any more here. Uh, Lots of memes, of course. Seen that there's no government firewalls for some mail-in bacteria, fungus, virus companies. Yeah, true, Matar, very true. Um, it is absolutely absurd that there's no kind of solid, widespread regulation of the sort of DNA constructs that one can order online. And as a kind of top priority, some sort of global governance of that would, um, uh, yeah. I think another thing is people wanted to hear what could be done, were dismissive because they felt nothing could be done, so why care? This is also a good point. So I I don't know whether I could have. I'm a bit disappointed with how I performed towards the end there. Um, I think I could have done a better job of presenting the policy options to be implemented to deal with these risks. Um, I kind of just listed them out fairly quickly, I think, and didn't explain in depth what each one would involve and why it's important, which is again on me, and I need to get better at communicating this sort of stuff. Um, so there definitely are things that we can do to ameliorate global biological risks. A lot of it sounds boring, but a lot of it is just doing more research and more international cooperation, which is the kind of stuff. And this ties in with another one of the criticisms that I saw a few times, which is sort of similar to um, what people asking kind of what can be done, is there were several people saying, well, yeah, obviously, we all know this. We all know that this is kind of scary. Whether we know the details or not, this is obviously something scary. Why are you even talking about it? It's so obvious. Um, which which I would kind of respond with, well, tell that to the policymakers. There are there are a lot of potential actions that we could take, some of which seem pretty trivial and obvious, like just more international cooperation, don't pull out of the WHO, things like this. But they are issues that people so often ignore, and I don't just mean kind of ignore as in nobody pays any attention to them, but ignore in the sense of electoral politics. Like, before COVID-19, when was the last time you heard pandemic preparedness be a thing discussed in presidential debates or prime ministerial debates, or uh, uh, shown on the highlights from um, Prime Minister's Question Time, or any of these kind of major platforms? And that's not just politicians not caring about these big issues, because if anything, a lot of politicians, Obama, for example, was very good about global pandemic governance, because I don't want to like simp for Obama, but he had a greater appreciation of the areas where government is very important that people don't widely recognise, of the things that you don't get thanks for when you're president, but you should nevertheless do, because it's very important and the kind of things that we hire, or that we elect representatives to deal with on our behalf. But the fact that we don't put a lot of pressure on them, the fact that uh, at any question and answer session, the main questions being asked will be about important, certainly, but nonetheless less big scale issues, like taxes, like the economy, like immigration, all these issues which are worth fighting for and are worth thinking about seriously, and so on and so forth. But other than climate change, there aren't many real big picture, kind of global risk issues that get widely discussed in everyday politics. So what I really wanted to kind of get across and communicate, which maybe I didn't do a great job of, is that we should be bringing this into the same kind of thought space as climate change, and we should be accelerating it, because whereas with climate change we have been perilously slow to act, and we have sat around ignoring the issue for decades, with engineered pandemics we may have even less time to act, and it's an even more kind of pressing but complex technical issue that we nonetheless need to try to engage with and try to spread the message about. So, when I say we need more international cooperation, what I'm trying to get across is we need to pressure our representatives and discuss in the media and take seriously things like Trump pulling out of the WHO. This is a massive, massive problem, um, both from the point of view of the kind of the everyday issues of global health, but also from the broader big picture issues of health security and not all dying in a pandemic. Um, and yeah, Golden here says getting climate change in the debate has been a challenge, still is a challenge. It absolutely is. Getting people to even care as much as they do now about climate change has been a massive uphill struggle, and one that I don't want to detract from. It's a couple of people in chat was sort of going, no, climate change is the only issue. Fuck you for talking about it. Maybe not fuck you, but kind of characterizing how they seem to be reacting, which I can kind of understand, because we've had to put so much effort in to just getting this far with climate change. It's understandable to kind of be protective of it and not want to have other issues muddying the waters. But this issue is, I believe, at least as important as climate change from pretty much every perspective. And getting that across without detracting from other big picture issues like climate change is, and it's something that I'm currently struggling with to communicate, because there's the ongoing protests about criminal justice reform, and obviously following the killing of George Floyd, and it would be it would be both bad optics for me and, more importantly, kind of callous and cruel for me to be like, yeah, it's just kind of like one person, and yeah, there's a lot of discrimination, but we're talking about the end of the world here. Can't you just pay attention to the end of the world? This is the most important issue. It's the only thing you should pay. That's not a good idea for all those issues, for all those reasons. So I still want to continue posting about and talking about this absolutely vital issue of us all not dying, but I don't want to do it at the expense of other important issues that people care about and people are emotionally invested in for perfectly legitimate reasons. And when you get the range of responses from, um, obviously this is true, why don't you, why are we even talking about it, to this isn't at all a problem, why are we talking about it? It's difficult to find a messaging strategy in there, um, especially when, given the comparison to climate change. For a few decades, I would say, one of the big problems climate change activists had was that they were all seen as, you know, granola munching, hemp wearing hippies from Greenpeace who, didn't care about anything but hugging the whales or whatever. Um, and a small part of that was true. I can't say I'm the biggest fan of Greenpeace for various reasons, but that was an unfair characterization that was in no small part perpetuated by companies and governments and individuals who had a vested interest in the climate change issue not succeeding and not getting widespread attention. So I am concerned that we'll encounter a similar barrier with communicating other existential risks. And already with AI, it came up in the chat a lot, and generally comes up anytime you discuss AI. There's this idea that it's a bunch of Silicon Valley bros who just want to jack off over uh, their own machine learning ideas, and they are completely out of touch with reality and so on and so forth. Which, again, it's not like that characterization is completely baseless. As someone who has quite a lot of friends around like Silicon Valley and in academia and so forth, there definitely is a bit of that kind of culture. But if we start just equating any attempt to take seriously the risks associated with AI with dumbass Silicon Valley bros who are heads up their asses or whatever, then we miss a lot of the very real concerns that are associated with this field, real concerns that most people working in the field have some kind of appreciation of, and even if you don't work in the field, there are some pretty clear-cut arguments, I think, that give us reason to be concerned. So the whole AI thing is perhaps a topic for another evening. Um, but yeah, just trying um, to communicate this in a way that doesn't give the impression of being completely transhumanist, crazy, whatever. Um, and I think part of that is kind of grounding the risk, and it's something I was chatting with Anders last week. Go back and watch my research stream last week, and you'll see we come up with quite a lot of arguments for why the end of the world would specifically be a really very bad thing without even necessarily resorting to the very long term, very big picture kind of perspective, by which I mean the trillions and trillions, quadrillions of potential future lives. Um, so maybe seeking, Neon Golden says, maybe seeking out people in the field who buck the stereotype is a good thing to prioritize, which, yeah, I think um, is a very good point and is something that hopefully I can do more of. Um, so, as you say, Dr. Michelle Hutchinson, who I had on last week, is, she's not a kind of stereotypical, Silicon Valley dude. She's a mother, Oxford academic with, a wide range of skills, and I think more communicators like that, and just hopefully what I can do is exposing people to exposing the you people out there in internet land to a wider range of the individuals working in this field, because most of them don't conform to these kind of lazy stereotypes of the Huel drinking or Soylent drinking tech dude on 200k a year who's just interested in AI. And a lot of people with uh, with a sort of solid basis in these topics, aren't nut jobs, but just getting that across. Um, Cumber99 asks, does the Future of Humanity Institute have a role in communicating these risks? The FHI doesn't do a huge amount of their own communication stuff. They've mostly got academics who will do media interviews, and I think they do have. I think they've got. I think they've got at least one member of staff whose main job it is to engage with the press. But yeah, I think there's definitely an opportunity for more people to um, start communicating about existential risk and global catastrophic risks, and doing so in a way that's hopefully more publicly engaging. Because, as I was saying earlier, with the kind of getting policymakers involved, there are a lot of people a lot of people with expertise who are already aware of how big a problem it is. But unless there's the political will to actually spend money on these problems, then very little gets done outside of the philanthropic sector, because you can convince. In some ways, it's easier to convince someone like, say, Elon Musk to read Nick Bostrom's book and then start plowing money into AI risk. So, and that's something that effective altruism has been focusing on a bit previously, is these kind of high net worth individuals, trying to persuade the richest people to give away their money to good causes. But even the very richest people have entire net worths that pale in comparison to the GDP of a major country. So, in order to get the real resources moved, the only option is to uh, to get governments involved. And yeah, like I say, that needs popular support. Um, so that brings me on to a couple of points that I wanted to kind of draw out a little bit in. I just didn't really cover in the discussion with Destiny, which um, I think was maybe a mistake. Um, just quickly, Neon Golden says maybe another thing is inviting on stream more people with expertise in politics. Uh, yeah, I think that's a good idea, and trying to set up more collaborations between people in politics and people who are working directly on these topics. And by people in politics, I mean not just the kind of high-end policymakers, but also political activists and potential political candidates and the people on the kind of grassroots end who nevertheless have a big impact filtering up. This is something that the climate change advocacy or the climate change amelioration advocacy movement has had some success with, I think, turning it into a bit of a grassroots movement, and yeah, something that I think is worth doing in the future. But yeah, two concepts that I didn't touch on properly, but I would have if I'd kind of had more time and maybe been a bit more focused. Was first of all, the as one of the solutions, a general kind of general purpose solution to the problem of these very powerful technologies that bring with them substantial risks is called differential technological development. So it's kind of an alternative to the precautionary principle. So rather than trying to uh, avoid developing technology on the basis that it might be risky and only develop things that we can be confident aren't risky, we instead try to, which would be the precautionary principle simply stated, we try to modulate in different directions different strands of technology that we think would be particularly risky or particularly likely to ameliorate risk. So several people, several commenters during the discussion were saying, well, if we're going to, if we're able to develop uh, pathogens that are capable of doing these nasty things, we'll probably be able to develop defenses against them, which unfortunately isn't necessarily true. By analogy, it's relatively easy for a nation to construct nuclear weapons and assuming they can get past international verification and so forth, but just in purely technical terms, it's relatively easy to build a nuclear weapon and a missile to send it halfway around the world. It's far, far more difficult to shoot down that missile in transit. The US has spent inordinate amounts of money on missile defense, and they're still only barely able to get it to work for small scale attacks. It's far, far easier for North Korea to send over 100 missiles than it is for the US to stop them. Um, and obviously, this doesn't map on perfectly with biotechnology, but it is kind of an illustrative example of why it's not always the case that just developing uh, an overall technology will make things safer as fast as they make them more dangerous. Which is why differential technological development is a good idea. So it's essentially the idea that we should, well, like I say, should focus on speeding up the risky stuff, the counter risk stuff, slowing down the most risky stuff. In the case of nuclear power, it might have meant putting a moratorium on any kind of uncontrolled fission experiments. So had we had good governance in the early days when these things were developed, we might have been able to slow down the development of weapons, but speed up the idea uh, speed up the development of the safer functions. Stanley K. Cly says, I've never been really convinced by this pulling orbs out of an urn idea of technology. Didn't stumble on nukes, we very deliberately created them. Um, yeah, no, we absolutely did in the case of nukes. We deliberately we identified that we could get a lot of energy out by splitting the atom, and pretty quickly started thinking of ways to use that to cause a lot of harm. So in the case of nukes, I think you're right there. There are probably some things that we should just not develop at all, or at least kind of wait for a while. But the complication there comes with uh, a lot of technologies being dual use and a lot of technologies not being obvious ahead of time how dangerous they're going to be. So, for example, CRISPR-Cas9 is a wonderful technology that we can use for many, many good bioengineering applications, biotech applications. Um, CRISPR-Cas9, for those who don't know, is a technique for editing DNA that was developed relatively recently, has become very popular. Um, but it might plausibly make it far easier for people to, oh, excuse me, for people to develop dangerous pathogens. So should we not have developed CRISPR-Cas9? It's too early to tell, and it's it's often not feasible to completely stop the development of a specific technology. So AI is a particularly good example of this, and generally any technology that is doesn't require a huge amount of infrastructure. Um, there's always the possibility of uh, a non-cooperative actor pushing forward with the development. Um, so, say in the case of nukes, if the US and if all of the allies had agreed that we shouldn't develop this is just far too dangerous, then there's a possibility that Germany would have developed it first and caused all kinds of problems. Now, of course, in the actual historical incident, Germany was really far away from developing functional nuclear weapons, not least because they chucked out a bunch of their best scientists. Um, but we can certainly imagine in general terms that uh, a bad actor can develop it faster, which I think is why the idea of differential technological development is particularly compelling, because it's not just about slowing down the risky stuff, the stuff that is obviously bad, but also speeding up things that we have a good reason to believe might provide more safety than risk. So in the case of bioweapons, I think we should probably be doing quite a lot of research into things like rapid vaccine development. And this is hopefully something that will become more popular in coming years, decades, as we uh, get over the COVID-19 pandemic and take stock. It should hopefully become a lot more preferable that we start developing a general procedures and technologies for rapidly going from identifying a pathogen to having a fully functional vaccine. And currently, this is massively impeded by the economics of vaccine development, as well as the kind of the politics and the practicalities. So, like a bunch of the Ebola vaccines initially got a whole load of funding, but then languished for ages, partially because testing them was difficult, but also partially because as soon as the Ebola epidemic kind of eased off, so did the funding, and people started losing interest. Um, so so yeah, going back to your kind of original point, I would agree that we should try to identify the really scary stuff and the things that's just obviously going to be a massive risk. Um, and nuclear weapons might well have been one of those. But uh, uh, yeah, it's not something we can do for every technology, so we should be trying to modulate up and down where we can. Though heavy-handed regulation is probably not going to be the way to go. Are there any people in the EA movement who take the pessimistic view that we can't avoid extinction? All we can do is stretch out 400 years to 800 and then just make the 800 the best we can. I don't know. I'm not sure if there is anybody, at least who, yeah, anyone prominent who kind of espouses this view. I don't think so. The the most of the estimates, if you look at like survey data of scientists working in risk analysis and related areas, um, or people who are interested in global catastrophic risks, or physicists, or any group of people who might know what they're talking about. Generally, few people will estimate that we have a very, very high chance of wiping ourselves out, by which I mean, say, greater than 90% or something. Um, but I think if we did have compelling reason to believe that there was, for example, if turns out our projections of climate change were way out, and there's some unknown, some feedback loop that we've just discovered that indicates that there is pretty much nothing we can do to stop the world turning into Venus, and basically all we can do is stretch out the time we have. Then I absolutely think we should. I think that uh, we should do everything we can to, within reason, obviously, to maximize the length of individual humans' lifespans, of our species' lifespan, and the quality of life during that time. Um, and I think if we did have strong reason to believe that there's just something coming that we could do nothing about, then I I think absolutely that would be our obligation. Fortunately, um, I think my view, and probably the kind of mainstream view here, at least within the people in AA who look into catastrophic and existential risks a lot, is that if we can get past the next few centuries, we've got a pretty decent chance of surviving for a very, very long period of time. Um, for uh, uh, potentially thousands, or many thousands, or millions of years. In which case, that suggests that we should be doing as much as we kind of feasibly can to make sure we do get past these next couple of centuries. And that brings me on actually quite nicely to the other key point, other than differential technological development, that I didn't kind of press as much as I should, which is the distinction between almost everyone dying and everyone dying. And I kind of touched on it in my earlier discussions about effective altruism generally with Destiny, but didn't really bring it home here, partially because I was the ethical argument I was making to try to persuade him was kind of sort of predicated on there being more discussion, more debate about uh, the future people value point. So my argument that people in the future have a large amount of value, and therefore we should put a lot of effort into making sure they don't all die. Um, which Destiny accepted quite readily, and it's nice that he did, and I'm pleased that our values are more aligned than I thought. But uh, it, it meant that I kind of skipped over a lot of the arguments in that space, and one of them is this point that almost everyone dying is far less bad than actually everyone dying. So if we look at the difference between 100 people dying and 200 people dying, that's pretty kind of linear. Most people will generally say, I think, assuming everything else equal, that 200 people dying is twice as bad as 100 people dying. Now, our kind of intuitive responses uh, to these facts of life aren't necessarily rational. They're not necessarily exactly in line with what our moral value, what we claim as our moral values. But if we step back and think about it rationally, I think most people would agree, 200 twice as bad as 100 people dying. But so we might then agree that, say, 20% of the world's population is twice as bad as dying is twice as bad as 10% of the world's population dying. But it doesn't then follow that 100% of the population is dying is 5 times as bad as 20% of the population dying. And it doesn't even necessarily follow that uh, uh, 100% of people dying is even merely 10 times as bad as 99% of people dying, because in that last 10%, in that last 1% is the hope for all possible future people. So if this is something I will hopefully be discussing in a bit more detail with Anders, and we kind of touched on a little bit last time I chatted with him, Dr. Anders Sandberg from the Future of Humanity Institute. Last time I chatted with him about the colonizing the universe, is that the possibility is very much there. There's nothing in the laws of physics that says we can't. For us, as far as we know, for us to spread out into the galaxy and beyond and form many, many millions of civilizations, and or part of one big civilization, and create a massive amount of value through human experience. I don't mean like just monetary value. I mean sort of intrinsic value. So if we lose, say, 7.5 billion people today, that would be by far the worst tragedy that's ever happened to the human species. But we would have 300 million people left, and that's almost certainly enough to uh, potentially at least rebuild. Now, it might be that they're at greater risk of being taken out by an asteroid, or at greater risk of a pandemic wiping them out, or whatever. But as long as a substantial enough chunk of humanity survives that we can repopulate, the actual difference in the very long term uh, is uh, is going to be, a few hundred years, a few thousand years maybe of development, which might not be that much in the big scale of things. But if we wipe out that last 1%, then we have no chance whatsoever of fulfilling our cosmic endowment of achieving all of the wonderful, wonderful things that our species might be able to. And and even if you think now that the world is terrible and that humanity is a cesspool or whatever, then you've still got to admit that there's a chance that we'll get better in the future. And I think unless one has a very pessimistic view of history, we can say with some confidence that now, uh, today, our moral values, our quality of life is substantially greater than it was in very long historical periods. And if we have a chance of continuing that development, then we have a serious shot at making a very, very bright future indeed. So just to take a quick break, I would like to put a very, very big thank you to Ben Meg, who has just become my first subscriber. So I now have a subscriber on the channel. I forgot to mention I am an Amazon, Twitch, whatever affiliate now. Um, but yeah, so thank you very much, Ben Meg. That is, thanks. Really, really appreciate it. And yeah, I have a subscriber now. Yay! Uh, so anyway, yeah, trying to convince even the antinatalists I see. Um, yeah, I absolutely am. I think even the people who think that humanity is somehow uh, currently terrible, or that human lives are currently not worth living, um, if we get rid of everything now, we've gotten rid of any potential for that getting better. And I think even the most committed antinatalists have to admit that there is some remote possibility, at very least, of things getting better. And there's a distinct possibility of things getting much, much better. Um, and without that final 1%, we lose all of that potential for things to get much, much, much better. So that's something that I would have liked to go into, and again, it's this damn pull, this tug of war between trying to be accurate and going into lots of depth and sorry, just a sec. Oh, get down. Very sorry about that. My cat was just getting up on the side in the kitchen. Um, right, apologies about that. Um, but yeah, the I think it's a point I would have made if I'd had enough time and enough eloquence. Um, J Tibbs says, oh, by the way, J Tibbs, thank you very much for your excellent comments during the discussion with Destiny. I really appreciate them. And yeah, so J Tibbs says, have you spoken to someone who's done work on the interactions between multiple disasters? This is this is a really important area, and it's something that I alluded to a bit, but I kind of felt like I had to skip over, at least somewhat, because it's not likely, or it's less likely that any one source of existential risk is going to wipe us out than multiple factors coming together to to cause a far greater catastrophe or extinction level event. Excuse me. And part of the problem, so I have spoken with some people who've done work on these interactions. Anders Sandberg has some work, and I was speaking with someone earlier who has done a bit of work. I'm not sure if they want me to speak about them, but a couple of people who hopefully might come on the stream at some point in the future. But part of the problem here is that there's just not that many people doing work into uh, the interactions between all the different types. So there are some people doing interesting work into like systemic uh, like robustness and the kind of system level, network level effects that can all um, pile in on each other to create much more complex outcomes. But uh, there's not a huge number of people uh, who are working on the confluences of these risks, not least because it requires a lot of specialty to be an expert about any one area of risk. So becoming an expert on multiple not at once is very difficult. Um, so I think being on Twitch, it may best lead towards convincing arguments and then point towards more sources. Yeah, you're probably right. I I also didn't present as many sources as I would have liked. Like I say, I linked my notes, which does have a lot of sources, and I would encourage people to go off and look through. But I was kind of running through the arguments in some degree of depth, uh, whereas in a couple of instances I could have just said, "Do you agree with this? Okay, great. Well, here's a source for anyone who might disagree." Um, and yeah, so uh, something called strategic foresight. Yeah, so there's uh, strategic foresight. Is this a general field? Because I'm familiar with some like strategic risk analysis stuff. Um, uh, Strategic foresight. Um, okay, I'm not. That's interesting. I'm not familiar with this as a kind of independent field of study. That looks really interesting. Um, so planning oriented discipline relate to future studies. Yeah, no, I haven't. I don't think I've encountered this as a kind of separate uh, process, um, which looks very interesting. Uh, cool. Well, JTibs, if you've got any um, interesting sources or whatnot on there, or if you'd like to come on chat sometime, I'd love to have you around because yeah, this looks interesting. And yeah, the field of foresight is a bit iffy because a lot of people don't do it rigorously enough. You're very true there. Um, it's it's always Policy Horizons Canada. Thank you. I'll have a proper look into that. Twitter. Uh, cool. Okay, yeah, that looks pretty cool. But yeah, the excuse me, the rigor of future predictions is it's so challenging because on the one hand, and you get back into this kind of theme of the stream today, which is uh, uh, this pull between you know clear messages and nuance, between being scientifically accurate and being compelling, um, and the in this case the kind of the pull between being rigorous and grounded and actually looking at the whole picture and making useful predictions. Because if you if when making predictions you only rely on current solid evidence of what we know and what we can prove, then you're not going to take into account any of the advances that are likely to come. But conversely, if you start trying to project every possible technological development, then you're going to go off into unhealthy speculation, and you're probably going to just miss a lot of the actual interactions that end up occurring between different technologies. And this is a thing in science fiction all the time, where they manage to an author manages to invent the internet, but people only use it for phone calls because they didn't have the insight. So they didn't have the insight to see what a um, uh, what more widespread effects um, would occur. So if focus on policy, the idea is to look across plausible futures and build robust solutions for all of them, while also looking for opportunities. That's something that I'm very interested in, and it's something that a lot of the work I like most kind of tries to do. I want I want to investigate what could occur, and yeah, yeah, there are a lot of futurists who are only really futurists because it's fun. Yeah, without like picking too much on anyone, there do seem to be a lot of people who will read, the current evidence and kind of go, "Ooh, here's all the cool things that might happen," without trying to take a grounded approach and without trying to actually plan out how to respond to these developments. It's something that I think the Future of Humanity Institute, a lot of the authors there do a particularly good job of, is trying to plot out the actual consequences and plausible policy responses to these kind of developments. Because it's always a challenge with the future, that with future planning, is that most of what you predict is kind of necessarily going to be wrong. It's something that, like, again, I wish I'd brought up a bit more when talking to Destiny, is that I don't think of yeah, Foresight Institute's good as well. Um, I don't think that any one of the risks I was discussing with Destiny is likely to end us all. I think more likely than not, each one of them won't end us all. Um, Obviously, I think climate change is definitely happening, but I'm talking about the risk of it killing humanity. It's pretty unlikely that climate change will kill humanity. It's pretty unlikely that an engineered pandemic will kill humanity. But there are enough of these different possible occurrences, that overall the risk is quite high. And similarly with future forecasting in general, it's extremely difficult to say. We can't say, okay, so self-driving cars are coming. Here are all of the things that are definitely going to happen, because some of those are certainly going to be wrong. We won't have taken into account the fact that I don't know, um, there's some special interest group who wants to keep cars human driven only for some weird philosophical reason that we haven't even considered. Or there might be an interaction between the self-driving cars tech with some other area of technology that we hadn't at all predicted. So the way you've kind of got to approach it is just make a bunch of predictions of possible outcomes, rather than trying to say this is definitely what's going to happen, and then try to plan for each one and try to keep those plans flexible. Um, so how I see it, we make production of something much easier and cheaper so other people can use it to produce new products or make some ideas work based on current tech, which is in high demand for money purposes. So that's certainly generally a big trend in technological development, um, and it's one that can have some very unexpected kind of non-linear effects on the systems that we're studying. So, like, if you look at the Human Genome Project, um, the bringing it down from in the I think it's 2002. It was it completed around then? First revision. Anyway, it cost billions of dollars to get the first human genome done, but that rapidly went down in price. I'll see if I can find a good picture of it. Sequencing of genome. Uh, Here we go. So it went down from how many things do I have to click through? Just there we go. 2001, hundreds of millions. This line is consistent with Moore's law, so the radical drop in the price of processors, and it's gone down even faster than that. So we've gone from 100 million to in the region of $1,000 for a genome, and that's not just a quantitative effect of X more people being able to afford to have it done, but it's a qualitative effect because it's opened the doors to certain types of research that we just wouldn't have had any ability to do previously, um, and for people to gain skills and techniques that they wouldn't have previously. Uh, Someone banned self-driving cars because trolley problem are inherently immoral because they're so annoying. Um, and Neon Golden, thank you. Yes, if people are interested in giving money in a way that covers a lot of these bases, a fund here. So that's the Effective Altruism Far Future Fund, which I plugged at the end of my discussion with Destiny, and they give a lot of high impact, or they give lots of payments to causes, to projects they think are going to be particularly high impact, whether this is research institutes or just individuals making cool, relevant stuff. So, for example, I think I'm correct in saying that Robert Miles, who I also mentioned, has received a grant from them. Um, so his wait, Robert Miles, Richard Miles? Am I? Oh God, have I just completely confused? Oh no, it is Robert Miles. Yeah, sorry, some singer or some such. So Robert Miles produces some absolutely superb content that's focused around explaining kind of concepts in artificial general intelligence, or artificial intelligence generally, but he's particularly um, focused on kind of AI risk. And so I'm pretty sure a couple of years back he got a grant from the EA Long Term Future Fund, and the quality and frequency of his videos has gone up markedly. And he's got 76,000 subscribers. He gets hundreds of thousands of, or 100,000 plus views on all of his recent videos, and he's he's doing very well what I was talking about earlier, which is presenting these important big picture issues in a way that doesn't seem like a crazy Silicon Valley bro. He's presenting them sensibly and reasonably, and he does a better job of presentation than I do. Um, and yeah, so if you want to support work of people like him, but also researchers working in this field, the EA Long Term Future Fund is an excellent way of doing it. And though the probability of any individual donation being the kind of the marginal, uh, dollar that prevents us all from going extinct, there's nonetheless a lot of expected value in donating to even quite long shot projects in this kind of space. So JTibs asks, any other streamers you're looking to collaborate with? Yeah, I'm currently speaking with a couple of people. Um, Hopefully on Wednesday around about my usual time, I will be uh, going on with Liz or Sudosia, um, who Sudosia is her like streaming name, who if she's on here, is not quite as big as Destiny, but nonetheless has a decent audience of her own, and I've interacted with her a bit on Twitter, and she's very lovely. Um, and what came up was she was chatting about Star Trek and like the wonderful things of the future, and a couple of people also started mentioning the Culture series, which I absolutely love. And I offered to come on and chat about the wonderful things in the far future. So yeah, on Wednesday we're going to be discussing this and hopefully having yeah, she is hopefully having a somewhat more light-hearted conversation than my one with Destiny, where we're discussing cool things in the future. Um, so give her a look and follow and everything. And I'm not sure if it'll be exactly on my usual time, but I'll be starting at my usual time of 8 p.m. UK time / 3 p.m. US East, and I will be going on at some point to discuss the future with her. Yeah, she mostly does econ stuff. I quite like her econ stuff. I'm not an expert in that field. I think she's kind of pretty soc dem, which yeah, I'd say I'm more like liberal, but uh, uh, I'm sympathetic to another brain fart, sympathetic to a lot of kind of SOCDEM arguments, and obviously these things all overlap, and it's all words for basically the same thing and whatnot. But yeah, she's interesting and seems fun to chat with, so we're going to have a talk about that, and hopefully this one should be. Whereas with Destiny, I was very much presenting a logical argument that I didn't want to be refuted. In this case, we're going to, I think, have a bit more of a speculative, you know, what if, kind of here are some of the cool things that might be possible, what would we like to see in the future, because I think that's something that's been really underserved in a lot of the kind of discussion of existential risk. And it's something, just to plug because I have to do it every stream, Toby Ord's book, which the one you actually get, if you buy it, it's not transparent, I swear. It's just but yeah, Toby Ord's book, The Precipice, does a fantastic job of not just explaining the risks involved and why we should kind of be worried about them, but also talking a bit about how wonderful life could be and how much value there is in seeing the future and living to, as a species, living to see ourselves spread throughout the stars and to not just that, but give ourselves time as a species to think about what we want to do in the long term, because that's a big open question. Is if we have, if we are alone in the universe, especially if we're alone in the galaxy, and we have a vast, almost incalculable quantity of resources available to us and trillions of years with which to play around with them, it's probably worth spending a few centuries or a couple of millennia just having a sit down, a nice cup of tea, and wonder about what we're going to do with all of that promise available to us. So, well, it's not necessarily the only thing that we should be thinking about. I think it's worth considering. Yes, I should make an Amazon affiliate link. That is an excellent point. Um, I will post that when I post this YouTube video. I'll certainly do that. Uh, but because I have previously done Amazon affiliate links when I've been linking ingredients for cocktails. I don't think anyone's actually bought any of them yet, but oh well, worth a shot. Um, but yeah, just I think it's no, that's not a my link to Toby Ord wasn't a Amazon affiliate link, but oh wait, was it? I can't remember. Um, but yeah, I should I'll definitely include links with all these things. I think on my Twitch profile I do have a link to the EA Far Future Fund, um, uh, which I would encourage you to check out, and I should include a like link into the precipice. Um, but yeah, uh, so I guess that's kind of the core stuff I wanted to talk about this evening, to get off my chest. I think overall I'm pleased with how the discussion with Destiny went, in as much as main uh, my main focus of it was, as I said at the start, was to convince him rather than to get lots of oh yeah, that makes more sense, J Tibbs. Yeah. Um, but yeah, my core purpose was to persuade him rather than his audience, or rather than getting more followers. Um, but hopefully I was persuasive. But I think there's definitely a lot of value that I could have captured in terms of being comparably sort of rigorously persuasive without sacrificing um, the the interest and the compellingness. So yeah, we live and learn. Um, Imagine if some alien form of life comes to Earth and talks about God. I mean, that might turn me away from atheism if they did. Um, Although they'd have to have some pretty compelling arguments. Uh, Also, if they came and talked about a God that wasn't at all similar to the Judeo-Christian God, that might make me think that that they have engaged in some sort of convergent mimetic evolution. It might be that if God did not exist, then and we were an alien, we would still have to invent him, or however that quote goes. Yeah, it could also be an alien troll. Um, so there are many reasons why we might be skeptical of that, but it would be potentially evidence in favour. Um, Though I don't completely rule out the existence of some kind of creator. I just think it's probably, well, if there is one, it seems unlikely that they're particularly involved with us on a day-to-day basis. And if they're Tyler Cowen thinks they'll send us ads. Yeah, maybe. I mean, they would say they believe and have no idea if it exists. Um, oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah. So if an alien form of life came and discussed God, um, how it would be to us, that makes sense. Yeah. Uh, right. So, any other kind of questions or whatnot before I shamble off? Um, I am, of course, open to uh, questions offline as well, so or off stream as well. So if anybody has questions you'd like to see me answer on stream, do feel free to send me an email, laurie.pycroft@gmail.com. I should probably also see if I can get postnormal@gmail.com. And or hit me up on Twitter. What's my favorite color? Um, So in terms of general aesthetics, I'd probably say black, as you can probably see. Uh, Kind of day to day, I would tend towards preferring black for sort of aesthetic purposes, but I do like imaginary colours, impossible colours, the ones you get from certain. I'm thinking of imaginary colours. Yeah, impossible colours. That's it. Impossible. Um, yeah. So go and read it. It's a very interesting area, and yeah, you can get a whole bunch of color perceptions that you can't get from normal sort of physical stimuli. And this actually goes into a very interesting, speaks to a very interesting distinction in neuroscience, which is the kind of um, the distinction between a stimulus, the physical phenomena that give rise to a perceptual process, and the perceptual process. So, in the instance of color, there's technically speaking, in a neuroscientific context, there's no such thing as red light. There is light that has about 600 nanometers or 580 or whatever nanometers uh, as its like peak wavelength. Um, that means that the property of red doesn't exist outside of our brains. So, uh, oh, yeah, what I would give to see ultraviolets. Fucking tell me about it. I know I was saying I'm trying not to come off as a crazy transhumanist earlier in the video, but I do have a small magnet implanted in my left ring finger, which allows me to feel um, certain oscillating electromagnetic fields. And the reason I got that is because it fascinates me as someone with a background in neuroscience. It fascinates me to be able to perceive aspects of the world that natural humans, that unaugmented humans, are unable to interact with. And a lot of science is all about just doing exactly that. It's about measuring things that we cannot easily, at least, perceive with our regular sensory apparatus. And interestingly, some people can see ultraviolet in a way. So if this is a decent um, uh, demonstrator of this, uh, the excitation peak here for blue, for example, is around um, sorry, the excitation peak for the blue um, photoreceptor is around 430 or something, 440 nanometers. But all of these photoreceptors, each of these is a protein in the eye, and the wavelength at which it's most excitable. All of these are potentially activated by other uh, forms of light, and indeed ultraviolet light will give some degree of activation of the proteins. Now, in your eye normally, your lens, the bit of tissue that is you see through, um, is is opaque to ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light doesn't go through it very well at all. But if you get it replaced for medical reasons with certain types of plastic, then they become transparent, the lens becomes transparent to ultraviolet light, and it'll pass through. And people who've had this operation can perceive UV light. They perceive it as a kind of bright bluish, purplish kind of color, which sort of makes sense because it's probably activating all of the photoreceptors at once to some degree. But what if we could see it like properly? That would be really, really cool. Um, and there's been some fascinating work in so that there are photoreceptors in nature, uh, uh, chemicals that proteins that will respond, as with here, respond to ultraviolet light preferentially. So some animals that are naturally able to see ultraviolet well will have a photoreceptor that responds strongly to ultraviolet light. Now, we've been able to, in monkeys, demonstrate that you can take an opsin, a protein that works in photoreceptors, and transfect it using an adenovirus into the retina of these monkeys and enable them to see. So these were monkeys that weren't capable of perceiving red light, as I say. Red is a kind of abstraction here, but aren't able to distinguish red from green naturally. They were given the opsin, the protein, for red photoreceptors, and afterwards were able to distinguish between red and green stimuli, which they naturally wouldn't be able to do. So these monkeys were able to perceive a whole new color in some kind of sense. We don't know what was actually going on inside their minds, obviously, but in some sense, we're able to perceive a whole new color that nobody in their species had ever been able to before. So what if we do that with humans and ultraviolet or infrared? We don't really know exactly what would happen from a kind of perceptual standpoint, what it would actually look like to perceive these things. And it's possible that it would vary greatly depending on the exact mechanism we used to enable this. But given how incredibly, incredibly effective the human brain, the human nervous system in general, is at rewiring to make sense of input coming in, there seems like a pretty good chance we would get some meaningful new color perception that nobody has ever experienced. Um, and I remember there's this book. Um, I'll look it up some other time, but there's this kid's book that I remember very distinctly from when I was a kid myself about a young girl inventor who uh, invented a form of ink that would show people what they wanted to see. And this was actually quite like an interesting. Actually, now that I think back on it, it was quite prophetic for some social media stuff today. Anyway, the point is, she made this invention, but she realised that it had a bunch of very negative effects that that she didn't want the world to have. So she helped take it down and remove it from society and create a better world free of her invention. But at the end of this, uh, her kind of wish for um, having agreed to get rid of this bad invention was a couple of kind of impossible dreams. So, wanted a unicorn and a few other things. But one of the things she wished for was a new color. And that always stuck with me very strongly. The the magic of a completely new experience, a fundamental new aspect of our perceptual reality always really fascinated me. Um, so yeah, my favorite color is one that we haven't yet perceived. And yeah, with that, Um, I think that was quite a good note to end on. So thank you very much for everybody watching, and particularly to my first ever subscriber, Ben Meg, and to J Tibbs, because you've been hugely supportive throughout the whole Destiny discussion. I really appreciated all your comments and everything. And just thanks to everyone who's been really lovely and wonderful and interesting. So, yeah, um, I will bid you adieu. Hope you all have a good evening or afternoon, or delete as appropriate to your current time zone. And I will be back on Wednesday um, uh, at 8 p.m. UK time, 3 p.m. US time, in order to have a chat with Sudosia and hopefully, chat about some nice, fun future stuff. Oh yeah, like, comment, subscribe, whatever. Do the things that feed the algorithms that might give me extra, good things. And yeah, have a good night. Ta ta.